I am Ana Julia Hattar, president of the Venezuelan American Association of the US. And for those who don't know, the Venezuelan American Association has been promoting interchange between Venezuela and the US over 80 years. I haven't been the president for that long. During this unprecedented crisis, VAUS has been diligent in fostering discussion to spark action. We thank you all because you have been accompanying us on our quest for more knowledge and for a better understanding of the situation in Venezuela today, and also for a better future of my country. I would also like to say a little bit more formally about Rabbi Pynchas Brener, who was born in Poland, and at the age of 4, he emigrated with his family to Peru. He speaks Spanish better than I do. His father, Abraham Brener, was the Grand Rabbi there in Peru for 30 years. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics at the Rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University in New York, and his master's degree in mathematical statistics. You don't fool with Rabbi Brener. He's a mathematician from Columbia University, and he has a PhD honoris causa from Bar Ilan University in Israel, of which he is a member of the Board of Governors. He was in Caracas as chief rabbi from 1967 to 2011. He was a rabbi of the Unión Israelita de Caracas, the Ashkenazi community in Venezuela. He's now its chief rabbi emeritus. Everybody calls him, Rabbi Brener. He's the rabbi of Venezuelans. In 1978, he founded the Committee on Relations among the Venezuelan Churches and Synagogues, of which he remains president. Rabbi Brener was professor of mathematics at the University Simón Bolívar, one of the most prestigious universities in Venezuela. In August last year, Rabbi Brener was named Venezuelan ambassador to Israel by acting President Juan Guaidó. It's an honor to all Venezuelans to have our ambassador in Israel in the person of Rabbi Brener. His appointment was confirmed by the Venezuelan National Assembly. I guess that we will talk about this in the conversation that is going to be moderated by my great friend, Michael Skoll. He's the vice president of VAUS, and he is principal at Skoll and Cerna, a US-Colombian consortium, providing counter money laundering and anti-corruption services for governments. We are in a great need of that in Latin America. He served 30 years in the US Foreign Service, including as ambassador to Venezuela, and then as principal deputy assistant secretary of state. I have to add that Ambassador Michael Skoll was President long before Chavez era. So we did share better times together, the three of us in Venezuela for some time. I have also to add that Mike has been Washington's premier troubleshooter for crisis in a number of Latin American countries. So I am delighted to have both of you today in this webinar. And Mike, this is your floor.
Thank you, Ana Julia. I should correct one thing. It is true that I was ambassador before Chavez was president, but I was ambassador when Chavez first tried to be president, when he had his first coup. Before we begin, let me explain the questioning process. You will see at the bottom a little Q&A button. Anytime during the proceedings, just press the Q&A button, write your a question in Spanish or English, and then later on during the second half of the program, when we turn to questions, then I will read your question for Rabbi Brener. Now it is for me a very special pleasure to be here with Rabbi Pynchas Brener. We knew each other in the last century, what seems to be a very, very long time ago, and in a very different sadly, a very different Venezuela. Rabbi Brener, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you very much for having me. And it's great to be with you, Michael. I remember you very well, and we are restarting once again our friendship, and I'm very happy because of it.
Very good, thank you. Let me begin with the title for this webinar, Regress and Progress. Rabbi Brener, what did you mean by that?
Well, very simply, you know, we have had a new regime in Venezuela for the past 22 years, I believe. So instead of going forward, we have gone backwards. We are actually in Venezuela, in some respects, in the 19th century. You know, we're going back in time. We are regressing instead of progressing. It's not only, and this I want to emphasize, it's not only that the present regime destroyed many of the institutions of Venezuela, including the constitution that they themselves passed. They disobey constantly. You have a congressman, Venezuelan congressman called diputados. They have immunity, supposedly, but they are in jail nevertheless. Many have had to run away from the country because they're being persecuted, disobeying the separation that should be present, should be the reality in any democracy, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. But in Venezuela, it's not so. So they have destroyed many things. Any commercial enterprise or industry that they touched, that they nationalized, they simply destroyed. New projects were started, but never finished. So many things were destroyed, but there's also something else that I think we should take into account. What about the progress? What about the advancement? What about the development that Venezuela should have had during these past 2 decades? When oil was at its peak, the income had never been seen in Venezuela in all its history during these past 2 decades. So what happened with where we should have been by now? Take any other country in the world, almost any other, maybe not Syria, you know, maybe not a place where there is civil war, but take any normal country, take it in the year 2000 and the year 2020. Is it the same country? Have they built something? Have they progressed in education and healthcare and whatever it is? Everybody goes forward, except Venezuela went backwards and did not go forward, which is the biggest crime maybe yet.
Rabbi, how important is the Venezuela-Israel relationship?
Well, I think first of all, the people of Venezuela that are basically democratic, freedom-loving people have much in common with Israel. Israel is in a region where you only have dictatorships or theocracies. The word democracy is not very well known there. And any attempts that wanted to have some kind of regime change and impose democracy sort of failed because it is not apparently in their DNA. So I think it is only natural for Venezuela and Israel to be close to each other because of our convictions, because of our love for freedom and human rights, respect for human rights. But in addition to that, Venezuela and many Latin American countries were the first to recognize Israel when it became a free nation in May 1948, following the decision of the United Nations in 1947 of creating an Arab state and a Jewish state. A Jewish state. That was the decision of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Unfortunately for the Arabs, and I feel for them as well, they did not establish their own state. Instead, what they wanted to do is eliminate Israel. They started the war the day after Israel declared its independence from all borders of Israel in order to destroy the country. And for the following years, until 1967, a period of 2 decades, the West Bank, or what is Samaria and Judea, according to the Israelis, was really ruled by Jordan. Why didn't they establish their own state? for some reason they didn't want to, because their attention was centered in destroying the Jewish state. I want to make a parenthesis and tell you the following. Everybody knows what happened during the Second World War with the Jewish people, the Holocaust. You know, a third of the Jewish people was assassinated methodically, you know, just for being Jewish, for no reason at all. I know that my wife's grandfather had migrated from Poland to Germany, and he was a young man. He served in the armed forces of Germany in the First World War. When the time of the Holocaust came, he said, to him, anything is going to happen to him. He is a German. He fought for the German Republic. And yet, of course, his fate was the same as everybody else's. So what happened there is indescribable. There's no parallel in history to the methodical, systematic, scientific destruction of a people. Genocide. That's what real genocide is. Would anybody not expect then Israel as a free country, well, to bomb a little Berlin or Munich or some country to take some revenge? But that's not what we do. We don't want to forget the past. We don't want to forget what happened before, but we want to look forward to the future. You know, how can we rebuild Israel, not destroy Germany, not destroy anybody else? We want to build ourselves. Golda Meir once said, when the Arabs will love their own children as much as necessary, maybe we'll have peace. Why don't you build? Why don't you go forward? Why don't you use Israel as a locomotive in order to progress and latch on to Israel? But unfortunately, that is not the case. So I think that Venezuela and Israel have much in common as far as basic morality, ethics, and so on. Unfortunately, in the year, I believe it was 2009, Chavez unilaterally and on a television program broke off relations, diplomatic relations with Israel, and asked the Israeli ambassador to leave the country in 72 hours. Well, since then, diplomatic relations between Israel and Venezuela do not exist. But the government of Juan Guaido, identifying with what our common ideals are between the people of Israel and the people of Venezuela, wants to reestablish relationships, diplomatic relationships with Israel. And it is also for the day after, the day, and I hope it comes soon, when we go back to democracy. Venezuela is a failed state. You know, the government doesn't rule all over the country. There are many geographic places that are governed by somebody else. Really, there are colectivos, there are all sorts of groups with arms and what have you. You need somebody who's an expert in fighting terrorism, in bringing order to a society, and Israel can do much for that. In addition, of course, the knowledge in water and agriculture and science and cyber, whatever you want. Israel is a country that is right on top, together with all the forward-looking countries in the world. You have to visit Israel to see what was done during the last 20 years. And that is what hurts me, because Venezuela could have done something and unfortunately did that.
Rabbi, is there something that Israel can do now to help Venezuela, to help the opposition, to help you, to help Juan Guaido?
Well, I'll tell you, you know, there's something called realpolitik, I don't know what, something like that. You know, like every country, you know, you want to do many things, but there are priorities. Right now, the pandemic is the number one priority all over the world. And then again, Israel has to deal with the United States, with China, with Russia, with the Arabs. Venezuela is thousands of kilometers away from Israel, so that it hardly appears in the press anything about Venezuela. And what I'm trying to do as of late is through interviews, through messages. We just established an internet page for the Venezuelan embassy in Israel to make our presence felt, so that Israeli society should be aware there is such a country as Venezuela that is going through certain problems and so on. But Israel is a small country, really. And if there were already diplomatic relations, maybe they would feel a little more obligated to do something for Venezuela right now.
Let's turn to another country in the Middle East, Iran. Iran is the common enemy of both Israel and the U.S. And as you know, Elliot Abrams has just been named as the U.S. Special Representative for Iran, and he's keeping his position as the U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela. What do you think of that? And what implications are there for common policies against Iran, which also help Venezuela?
Well, I'll tell you, for Venezuela, there's a penetration, of course, of Iran, we know, including, of course, a big supermarket, which they really took over another supermarket and just painted it over, something like that. They didn't build anything new. But there is, who knows, a military presence. There were 19 flights, I think, of their airline during this pandemic in 1 month that came from Tehran to Venezuela. As a matter of fact, the Venezuelan airline used to have weekly flights from Caracas that ended up in Tehran. What do we have with Tehran? It's thousands of kilometers away. For Israel, Iran is actually the most vicious enemy at this time. And Iran is probably, I don't know it for sure, but I'll just guess, probably an hour's flight by jet from Israel to Iran. Even though it doesn't have a border with Israel, it's right next door.
It's
anyway,
a shorter time via missiles too.
Well, it's minutes, of course, when it comes to, that's right, of course. And it's the only country that has threatened to erase another member country of the United Nations off the map. No one has ever done that, and yet they do that. In other words, they are actually a sworn enemy of Israel. They are not an Arab country. They're not Arabs, but they're Muslims. And they feel this is their connection with, they've made this destruction of Israel one of their mottos. You know, all these regimes, autocratic regimes, usually need an enemy from outside. You explain why aren't things going well, because this one does that, the other, not because it's our fault in government, not because we don't know how to govern. So while the United States is the great Satan for Iran, Israel is the little Satan, but it's a Satan. Well, I don't think they can destroy the United States, but Israel can be threatened, and Israel is extremely worried. That is why Israel is also interested in what Iran is doing in Latin America, especially in Venezuela. This is an interest that they have in common. But let us remember that the threat to Israel is 100 times greater from Iran than it is to Venezuela, because Israel is just next door to Iran.
On Iran, do you think there's more that the U.S. Should be doing? More sanctions, especially secondary sanctions. There are a great many areas of secondary sanctions which have not come to pass yet in U.S. policy, and they have been promised. Other actions that have been suggested include actions against Iranian oil tankers approaching Venezuela. What do you think U.S. policy should be in the future?
I think they are in that direction. It should be to constantly increase the pressure on Iran. Very few people would like to see a war, a real war with shooting with deaths, anything like that. But on the other hand, the United States is a tremendous economic power in the world. Let us not forget that it is the first economic power in the world today. So I think they can exercise much greater pressure. Of course, I think you need greater alliance with the European countries, that they should also do the same. However, you know, as they say that General de Gaulle once said, or maybe somebody else said it, I heard it in his name, nations have interests, they don't have friends. And the interests of many countries are economic. They're doing business with the Iranians, and the mighty dollar or whatever it is sometimes overtakes moral and ethical considerations. But I think if greater pressure were to be exerted, not only by the United States, but also by Europe, I think it would certainly debilitate tremendously this Iranian regime.
By the way, I just got one of these funny little flashes on my screen which said that President Trump has just announced that Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are going to establish normal relations.
Great news, great news, great news. It's about time, because finally you're going to realize that the problem in the Middle East is not Israel. Right now, it is very clear. It is a confrontation between Shiites and Sunnis. On the one hand, led by Saudi Arabia, the Shiites, the Sunnis, I'm sorry, and Iran with the Shiites. This is the real conflict of power in the Middle East. And the Palestinians are just a pawn that are being used by other countries. Why have they not absorbed the Palestinians in their own countries? And they keep them in separate sectors. They don't integrate into their society. And it's the easiest thing, because they have the same religion, they have the same language, they look alike. They are all Arabs. Why don't they integrate? They just use them as pawns in order to somehow tell their people why things aren't the way they should be. Why are hospitals in Israel functioning very well, and in Jordan they don't function very well? Why? Because of the Palestinian problem. Well, this is their logic, and this is what they've been using. So I salute, and I think it's an extraordinary piece of news that the United Arab Emirates have established diplomatic relations with Israel. Great news.
Very good. Let's get back closer to Venezuela. There are many who have suggested that the opposition, meaning Juan Guaido, whose government you are part of, that the opposition is running out of steam. Is this true?
You know, in Spanish we say, entre bomberos no nos pisamos la manguera. You know, I work with the government of Juan Guaido. I don't want to criticize the government of Juan Guaido, but on the other hand, I am aware of nothing is perfect. Everything is perfectible. The opposition could do better than what it's doing. But you have to bear in mind also that their means are limited. You know, you have a government that has all power. Especially the armed forces and all these colectivos, they're under constant threats, some of which I ignore because I don't live right now in Venezuela. It is not easy to be an opposition leader in Venezuela right now. So I certainly don't want to criticize them. But to say that they could do more, obviously, yes. What they could do, I really don't know. I think there are better minds than mine who can direct what the opposition should do. One thing I have clear. I think that President Guaido should have a more horizontal base, not only political parties. I think it should have been the Conference of Bishops. It should be the universities, the workers, all the colegios in Venezuela, the lawyers, the engineers. They all have groups. All these groups should be together. The academies that they have, intellectual academy, to form a national type of base for Guaido's government, and not only a political platform. I think that's a great idea they should try to implement.
Very good. Juan Guaido's ambassador to the US, Carlos Vecchio, has said that admitted that the opposition initially underestimated Maduro, meaning they underestimated his ability to resist change, to resist the opposition, to resist democracy. Do you agree with that?
100%. And I think that those that call him a donkey or God knows what are being ridiculous. You know, nobody, in my experience, nobody gets to a position of power being an idiot. If he is there, that hundreds of people, dozens of people, a few people that want his place. And if he is able to retain it, obviously he's got something. And the worst thing you can do is to underestimate the intelligence of your opponent. You can overestimate maybe their knowledge, but don't underestimate their intelligence. He's obviously a very capable individual, and you have to give him credit. I don't think he ever went to a college in his life. He has very little formal education, and yet he's able to be the president and stay there already for quite a number of years. So be careful. He's very capable.
And he has the support other countries and a lot of people, Cuba, for example. You have called Venezuela a colony of Cuba. And it's certainly true that the Castros, first Fidel and then his brother, have created a dictatorial model, a model of survival. It certainly has served Cuba or served the Castros well. Look how long they've survived. And anyone who studies recent Venezuelan history knows that Venezuela, Maduro and company, Chavez, have followed the Castro model exactly. It's parallel in some ways to North Korea. You and I, Rabbi Brener, remember an older era of Latin American dictatorships when all that had to be done when the dictatorship was failing was to take the dictator, his wife, his children, a couple of hangers-on, and send them to Paraguay. You can't do that so easily when there are all those generals and all those Cubans in the country. It's a fortified dictatorship such as few have existed in Latin American history. Well, I've talked too much. What do you think of that?
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that some of the European countries, at least I'm sure they know what's going on, but they don't want to admit it publicly. This is not, in quotation marks, a normal dictatorship. This isn't the case at all. You have a group that has overtaken a country for their own personal benefit. I was thinking a few days ago, look at what happened in the Soviet Union. I remember Yeltsin and finally Gorbachev. The revolution came from within. They realized, they have a feeling for the Russian people. Their system just isn't working. Let us try something else. I think anybody in the Maduro regime has to ask himself, look at the inflation level. Look at where people are in the situation of people today, $1.25, $1.50, I don't know what. I get pensión de vejez in Venezuela. And I spoke to one of my children who is in Venezuela, who manages whatever I have in Venezuela, which is nothing. And I said, how much is the pensión de vejez? Well, it was about $1.40 a month. But the following day, he told me, no, the dollar moved. It's $1.25. I got $1.25 a month. People work there for $3, $4, $5 a month. How can you subsist on that? I ask myself, those in government, they know what's going on. Don't they have any feelings for their own people, for their own country? Is there no patriotism in that? Look, we tried the system. We believe in a certain system. We tried it for 2 decades already, and it doesn't work. Where in the world does it work? Does it work in North Korea? Does it work in Cuba? Really? I was in Cuba. I know what's going on in Cuba. People are sad. Do you know what the conga is? Maybe you're old enough. Maybe not. It's certain dance, conga. Yeah, conga. That came from Cuba. From Cuba, you had a lot of goodwill, music, laughter. When is the last piece of music that you got from Cuba? The people are sad. It's a different Cuba. In Cuba, you don't want to get up in the morning. Why should you get up in the morning? What will you have better the following day? So don't the Venezuelan people in government with a country that is rich, but it's going to become less and less rich because oil is not going to play the same role in the future as it has in the past. You can see by the price of oil and alternate energy that is being used by many people. There's a little window of opportunity to still do something with the oil in Venezuela in order to do something for the people. Don't they have any sentiment for? Well, apparently, maybe they do, but maybe they're prisoners of drug trafficking, of certain foreign interests that don't permit them to really exercise. I can't think of a person born in Venezuela, a military man, knowing what's going on in Venezuela, and he should stand by idly and permit that the country be devoured, really.
Well, but that general is living very well as the 2,000 or 3,000 other generals in Venezuela. You know that Venezuela has more generals than the United States Army.
Than all of Europe together.
Yes. Well, there are only 2 generals in Europe, but there are more Venezuelan generals, yes, than much of the rest of the world combined. They live very well. Their money is elsewhere. I have recommended before that 57th Street in New York City be renamed the Avenida Bolivar because of the number of rich Venezuelans, meaning Venezuelan generals and others, who have apartments on 56th, 57th, 58th Street. You look up at them, they're dark at night because they own the apartments, but most of them can't come into the United States. Let's get back to your phrase, colony of Cuba. Venezuela today is to a large extent controlled is the better word, by Cuba, because Venezuela represents a lifeline for Cuba. One has to be, I think, somewhat pessimistic about the future of Venezuela as long as so much control is in the hands of the Cuban regime. No?
I'll tell you a personal experience. In the beginning of the Chavez regime, I was very friendly with Jose Vicente Rangel, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I even made a party for him. And I have an anecdote about it. A member of my community told me, how do you make a party for a leftist? You know, Rabbi, we are not like that. So I told him, wait till he sits down in the seat of being the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He'll look at the United States with a different eye. He'll behave in a different way. When he didn't have such responsibility, maybe he said things, but now he'll be much more moderate. So don't listen, Rabbi. If you have a car that pulls to the left, so you can compensate with that with the wheel, you move it a little to the right. However, the moment you let go of the steering wheel, boom, it goes to the left. That's what it is, unfortunately. In the beginning, we thought maybe it's like that. I used to have a Venezuelan diplomatic passport for being the rabbi. And I used to send it every year to the Ministry of Foreign, the Interior Ministry, wherever they give the passport, for its renewal, and in a day I would pick it up to have it renewed. Last time, which was maybe in 2001 or something like that, I didn't get the passport back. I called back, no bajó todavía. They didn't send it down from upstairs. Finally, I learned that the Cuban overseer of the passport said, who is the rabbi? Why should he have a diplomatic passport? No. It was the Cuban that decided whether I get a passport or not. Well, I took a regular passport. It was no big deal for me to have the diplomatic, but it was the Cuban decided what to do. That is exactly what I was told. The cable on the floor of the ocean that goes from Caracas to Havana. A cable where all data is transmitted. All properties, identity, everything is really controlled from Havana. And according to Raul Castro, there are some 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela. So maybe you can multiply it by 3 or 4, maybe there's 60,000. Who knows how many Cubans there are in Venezuela. The other countries, China, Russia, have certain general interests, but Cuba is infiltrated all over. An army captain can't move, can't do anything, can't make a call, can't do anything without him being somehow spied upon. Like in Cuba, in Cuba, I was in Cuba, there was a guy in every block who was the overseer of the block. And if your child didn't go to school for 3 days in a row, he'd knock on your door. What's wrong? How come your child didn't go to school? What business is it of him? But he is the one in charge of the block. So if something is out of the ordinary, he has to report what's going on. Well, that's what it is, unfortunately for us. But I repeat again, I cannot understand a general even having all the money and so on. Where is his heart? Where is the oath that he took to defend Venezuela? How does he permit that to happen? Because he knows what's going on with the rest of the people.
Yes, but he, first of all, he has his Cuban handler. He's afraid of him. And then this very same general is afraid of what happens next. He's probably on every blacklist in the world. He can be extradited anywhere. And quite frankly, a promise of amnesty by whom? If I were a Venezuelan general, I would be looking over my shoulder too. I would be very worried. I'm struck by the genius, if you want to call it that, of the Castro Chavez model, and they've tried it in other places. Fortunately, it hasn't quite worked in places like Ecuador. But it is a frightening situation. At least in turning back to the U.S., at least the U.S. policy on Venezuela seems to be bipartisan. I think it is bipartisan. It's possibly one of the very few policies in Washington of the government that does have bipartisan support, and that should be of some help, at least to Venezuelans and to the opposition. We all remember the appearance of Juan Guaido at the State of the Union speech of President Trump a year and a half and more ago, and one assumes that policy will continue. But what do you think of that?
Well, I'll tell you, from the point of view of the United States, I think they're the country that is most consequent, friendly to the Venezuelan opposition. They're trying very hard, and maybe they can do some additional measures. But I want to take a look at it from the point of view of somebody living in Venezuela. Every day that passes is the most important day if something doesn't happen. There are people dying of illness. There are people dying of hunger. What about the children that don't receive the proper nutrients in their early years? How will they grow up? Will they be able to compete with others? Will they develop intellectually properly? You know, we're dealing with something that the consequences cannot even be measured right now. Every day that passes is a tremendous personal tragedy for many Venezuelans. While from the United States point of view, I think they're doing well, but from the Venezuelan point of view, it's not enough. It will never be enough until there is a change of regime.
Yeah. Let me remind people that if you want to ask a question of Rabbi Brener, just click the little chat, not chat, the Q&A button on the side, and we will answer he will answer, don't expect me to, he will answer your questions. I don't see any questions yet, so I will just continue. Rabbi Brener, could you tell us something about the Venezuelan Jewish community in South Florida?
Well, in South Florida, I think that is the address where most of the Jews that left Venezuela in the last couple of decades reside today, even though many are in Panama, also some in Spain, some in different parts of the United States, some in other parts of Europe, some in Israel. But I think that Miami, South Florida, is the main address because, you know, Miami is half Latin, so to speak. You know, it belongs to Latin America too. Spanish is a language that enables you to live here without even knowing English, which is a reality, so that the culture shock in going to another country with a different language in Miami is alleviated by that fact. And then again, the climate is also much more benign, similar to Venezuela, so that they can acclimate themselves. And once there is a certain group, they attract others as well. And they remain united. However, their children are becoming Americans. You know, when you think about returning to Venezuela, maybe some will for business reasons, but they will retain, if they had some kind of success in adapting in the United States, they will probably remain in the United States because their children are already American. They don't have the same feelings for Venezuela as those of us who lived there for many years. So that the damage is tremendous. You know, Venezuela has a lot of very capable people, and we cannot forget the people that did very well outside of Venezuela. We thought that just because in Venezuela, the competition maybe is not as fierce. Maybe they can progress. And in the United States, it would be different. Yet you have many people who distinguish themselves. Ahí está Ana Julia Jatar, que nos presentó, who introduced us. Her husband is a very prominent scientist, professor at Harvard University, very recognized by other countries whom he has helped. And I remember him saying once that he is helping how to redo the economies of many countries, but his own country, Venezuela, he's not able to do because they don't permit him to do so.
Okay, here's a question. This is from Larry Luxner, an old friend. Rabbi Brener, could you please speak a bit about conditions for Venezuelan Jews still residing there? How many remain in Venezuela? What is their economic situation? And do they face increasing anti-Semitism under Maduro?
Well, I want to be fair to Maduro as well. I don't think that there is overt anti-Semitism against the Jewish community, except for a few incidents that occurred several years ago where the Jewish school was invaded, the Sephardic synagogue was violated. But in the last few years, I haven't heard of any incident. On the other hand, they suffer, like most of the middle class to which they belong, suffer in Venezuela because of the economic situation, because of the lack of electricity, water, and so on, because of the insecurity and so on. But as I say, there's about a quarter of the Jewish community that remains there. And some remain there because it is very difficult for a person when they reach a certain stage in life, age, to move to another place. It is like, they say it's like mourning, you know, it's a death in the family when you have to move from one place to another with a different language, different environment. And they're used to, they have their people who help them there. They know exactly where to go. So many people out of personal comfort remain there and don't go out at night, try to be careful. Others maybe are still engaged in some business. And there are others, many others, that don't have the means to move. You know, to move to the United States, you need some economic means. You arrive here and then you have to establish yourself. And there are many that cannot obtain visas and so on. It is a complicated issue. So there are all sorts of reasons why some people remain there. But I don't know of anybody in the Jewish community that sympathizes with this government, not at all. But then again, the Jewish community per se never took a political position. You know, we are too small. We don't intervene in politics. We are interested in our education. We are interested in our religion. We are interested actually in a free society where you can compete freely. And this was the case, of course, for all the decades of democracy in Venezuela.
Rabbi Brener, we are living in a virtual world right now, and you have followed suit in the sense that you have established a new website for the Venezuelan embassy in Israel. And I understand that we are also simultaneously broadcasting on that website right now, this webinar. Can you tell us a little bit about the website?
Well, I'll tell you, since diplomatic relations were broken off between Israel and Venezuela, we don't have any legal standing, really. They recognize me as the representative of Juan Guaido, but we're trying to create a presence of Venezuela in Israel, to tell the people, to tell society there is such a country as Venezuela, what our customs are, what our fortes are, what our weaknesses are. And we established only a few days ago, as a matter of fact, I think it was last Friday that we launched it, a new site of the Venezuelan embassy in Israel. And I think it's very good, you know, but then again, I'm not objective about it, you realize. But I invite people to go into that site and look for Venezuelan embassy in Israel, and you will find it's alive. We try to maintain it daily. I usually do not go back to any site where I see that the latest news is from 1998 or from 2017, if it is not renewed constantly. Where our site is, as a matter of fact, when you enter our site, you will see on the top left a clock with the time in Venezuela and the time in Israel and the date. that changes constantly. That is a service I imagine that we obtained from someplace, just to show that this is a live website. You will find news about Venezuela there, you will find news about Israel, and you will find international news that have to do with Venezuela. And I'm very proud of it. And by the way, it was designed and it's being maintained by volunteers, Venezuelans. One Venezuelan lives in Spain, another one lives in Venezuela, another one lives in Israel, all volunteers in order to do that.
Tell us again exactly what the website is.
Oh, my friend, you're asking me something. I
think it's Embajada Venezolana.
I'll tell you in 1 second so that we shouldn't make any mistake. It is Embajada Venezuela Israel.org.
Okay.
Embajada Venezuela Israel, that's all in Spanish, .org.
Very good. Here's another question. This is from Martha Cecilia Insignares. Thank you, Rabbi and Michael, for this presentation. Trump issued the declaration in the year of Jubilee recognizing Jerusalem after 70 years. What will happen to Israel and Venezuela if the radical left try to remove President Trump from his position in November?
Well, I am a rabbi and not a prophet. So I really don't know. But some people say that when it comes to Israel, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party sort of coincide. I would doubt very much that if Biden is elected president of the United States, he will change the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. I doubt that very much. But on the other hand, I'm not a prophet. Everything is possible in this world. As a matter of fact, I would like the embassy of Venezuela to be established very soon physically in Israel and in the city of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. If you want to go to see the prime minister, any ministry, the Knesset, everything is in Jerusalem. Now, we are not speaking about old Jerusalem that has a wall around it where the mosque is situated, where there is a church that supposedly guards the remains of Jesus or anything like that. It's the occidental part, the western part of Jerusalem that was built by Israel. It's the modern Jerusalem. That's where the embassy should be, because from a practical point of view, that's most, it brings the greater use for it. And as a matter of fact, when Venezuela first established relations with Israel, the embassy was in Jerusalem. Since it was interrupted and we have no embassy, we are not moving an embassy from one place to another. We are establishing it in Jerusalem, which is the capital. And I think every nation has the right to declare which city is its capital, and that's Western Jerusalem.
Rabbi, Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, has just announced that his Vice President, Kamala Harris, and there has been a lot of newspaper reporting, especially from Times of Israel, that her husband, in fact, is Jewish. What do you make of that?
Well, I know that is a fact. She spoke about her mother-in-law and imitated what her mother-in-law's reaction. She's quite an intelligent woman, this Kamala Harris, no question about it. But I don't think that that has any effect, because there's a sector of American Jews that don't have this affinity to Israel that some others do. As a matter of fact, the majority don't have the same affinity. I don't know what her husband's situation is. And I think that she has her own mind, quite clear what she thinks ought to be done. And I certainly hope that she's not anti-Israel. I don't want her to be in favor. I just don't want her to be anti, because in the United Nations, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, the majority of resolutions against any country are against Israel. They say that a Martian came to Earth and he wants to know where Israel is. They told him Israel is a little country. What? He said, after all the noise he hears about Israel, he thought that's the size of China or the Soviet Union. But this is unfortunately the fact. Golda Meir once said that we are the only country in the United Nations that have no league. We don't have friends. Hebrew is spoken only in Israel. You know, any Arab country immediately has other Latin America. Venezuela has other Latin American countries, English-speaking countries, Germanic-speaking countries, European. Israel is by itself. So maybe it doesn't have anybody to defend itself, but it has morals, ethics, and it has a long history of resisting. It's very resilient. Many have tried to do something against the Jews, but I think they have all failed. The Egyptians of today are not the followers of any pharaoh from then, but we follow exactly what Moses told us in Mount Sinai.
Rabbi Brener, we have something from Leslie Simon, who is the president of the Venezuelan American Chamber of Commerce, which used to be in Caracas. It's now next door to you in Miami. Leslie says, just to say thanks to Rabbi and Ambassador for this excelente presentation.
Well, muchísimas gracias.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
Rabbi, I cannot resist this final question. It has very little or nothing to do with Israel or Venezuela. I would very much like to hear your reaction to what's happened to former President Uribe in Colombia.
Well, now I'll tell you something that is very personal. I am not speaking in the name of any government or anything, but I am very worried about what is going on in the entire world. You know, in Germany, if you would have spoken to any German Jew in 1925 and 1930 and tell him that something is going to happen against the Jews, he would never have believed it, because they considered themselves Germans of Mosaic faith. They had a different faith. As a matter of fact, the entire Reform movement, some say, started out because they wanted to convert the synagogue into a Jewish church. In other words, German spoken, the rabbi should wear some kind of distinctive dress, orderly, not like a synagogue that is sort of a free-for-all like it used to be. They wanted more to imitate more the Protestant type of atmosphere. And yet we saw what happened in Germany. I see all over the world, you know, what happened in Chile, the demonstrations in Chile where they burned subway stations. That is not a normal protest at all. We see in the United States, I think what happened with Floyd is horrible. There's no excuse for it. And the Black community has every right to demonstrate and to make sure that this doesn't repeat itself. You know, I agree 100%, but that doesn't excuse looting and destroying and so. And that is, I think, done by elements that are subversive. I think that the left is very well organized. And I feel the following. Some in the left, those that want to destroy Western culture, are willing to die for it. Is anybody who is a Democrat willing to die for democracy? Why should I die for democracy? Democracy is what is around. They are much more intense in their feelings. And I find that what happened to Uribe is horrible. He's the best president, I think, that Colombia had. For many, many years, he brought about order into the country. So many things. I'll tell you one little anecdote. There was once a friend of mine, a congressman in Venezuela, who told me the following, that a judge had before him in Colombia one of those traffickers and so on, and he was visited by somebody who said, you know, Your Honor, you know, you have this in this case, we would appreciate very much that you deal kindly with him. He says, well, I deal with things the way it should be. Well, and he brought a bag with $1 million in bills. And he said to him, you know, as recognition for your friendship, we're going. So he says to the man, listen, I have conducted my life in a certain way, and I'm not going to sell myself or anything. I will judge it according to the facts. Okay. So the man said, well, you know, you also have children, you have grandchildren. Suddenly your grandchild crosses the street and a car comes out of nowhere and kills him. You know what can happen. You know, we live in a very dangerous. The judge understood what it was. He took the money and he adjudicated the case, and he went to the president of Colombia and gave him the money. And he said to him, I didn't touch this money, but I want you to know that I was under threat of a grandchild, and I cannot permit that. Well, I don't know what was the end. I think the grandchild was killed afterwards or something. Something happened to the judge. Terrible. So I said, why? He says, well, what did the president do with that bag of bills? He must have given it to somebody. Well, the drug trafficking is infiltrated all over. They said, including the church, the armed forces, wherever you are, dollars penetrate everywhere. And I think Uribe did a tremendous job in trying to clean up Colombia. And well, he is being repaid by an organized left who have learned that what you have to do is take a hold of the judicial system. If you have the judicial system in your hands, you can do many things. And unfortunately, this is what happened. My great sympathy for Alvaro Uribe, who I think is a true hero of Colombia and of Latin America.
Rabbi, for what it's worth, I could not agree with you more. And the fact is that I knew what you were going to say, and I wanted to hear you say it again to all
Just
these
wanted
people.
to hear it.
Again, thank you very much for being with us. I will pass the baton or the floor back to Ana Julia.
Well, I'm here. I don't know if anybody can see me, but yeah, okay, here I am. This has been a fabulous walk through so many interesting issues. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rabbi, especially you, Rabbi, for taking the time to share with us your wisdom and your knowledge about, Israel, Venezuela, Cuba, and Venezuela. By the way, my family from my mother's side is all from Cuba. They lost one country, and now we are losing a second one, which is, I feel with you all the things you said, and I could not agree with you more of what you just said about Uribe. It worries me a little bit that it's very similar to what happened to Carlos Andrés Perez, when the judicial system decided, and it's really worrisome. But anyway, that's my opinion. Thank you so much. Hope to have you again soon. And we, as an institution, want to wish you all the luck in your embassy representing Venezuela in Israel in these very important times. And I would also like to thank our team, which worked so hard: Lina Delgado, Linda Calvet, Lori Dominguez, who is in charge of all this logistics for the webinars. And I want to tell everybody that we are doing these webinars almost every month. So keep in touch. And if you're not already a member, I am the president of the Venezuelan Association of the US. That's what I am here today. I would love to invite you all to join the association. And if you would like to join, just get in contact with our team through the invitation you received. Thank you all again. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and my blessing to all of our listeners and to everybody, that God should keep us safe in these very difficult times of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you.